everyone, welcome back to the Brush and Bubbles channel. Today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this forest mountain scene. This looks quite complicated to do yourself, but I am breaking it down and it is easier than it looks. I'll be showing you exactly what equipment I'm using, the paints that I'm using, how I'm mixing up the colours, and a few tips on how to apply the paint to the canvas to get your desired look. If you want to change up your own painting, there is certainly freedom to do so. You can change the colours, the composition, you can go slightly more abstract. I find that these scenes are extremely calming and quite therapeutic to paint, but you just want to make sure that you're enjoying the process. And remember, we're painting nature, so nothing is ever perfect. If you want to go a little bit more stylized with your painting, then please feel free to do so. So let's jump straight into the tutorial where I'll be showing you exactly what I'm using to create this painting. I'm using a stretched canvas today and a standing easel, so I'm just securing that together now and prepping my area. You'll need some paintbrushes. This is personal preference and depends on the size of the canvas. I'm using a palette sheet today and I've got some kitchen towel just to dab my brushes off in and a pot of water. I'm going to be using acrylic paint, so I've got quite a lot of white acrylic here. I'm then going to be using this ultramarine blue by Winsor & Newton. I've then got a violet shade, so this is a deep purple, a primary magenta, which is a pink, and then a cadmium yellow deep hue, also Winsor & Newton. I'm then going to be adding a little bit of black paint in the top corner of my palette. I'll be using it a little bit later. So I have white, blue, violet, pink, yellow and black. So paintbrushes are very personal preference and it does depend on the size of the canvas that you're using, but I tend to just pick 3 of my main paintbrushes. So I've got a bigger one, a medium and then a tiny one. So I'm just prepping my area, making sure I've got everything I need, my water, my kitchen towel, my paintbrushes, my paints and my palette, and then I'm going to be ready to go. So I'd set yourself up now. We're going to start just by mixing up a really light colour. I'm just going to mix up a light blue, so I'm just dipped my paintbrush in the water to loosen up the bristles. Starting with a large scoop of white, and I'm just adding a tiny bit of blue to this, just mixing it together. We're now just going to sketch onto our canvas the rough configuration of where we want our mountains or hills to go. So don't worry about this too much. I know it's scary because it's the first marks on the canvas, but we just want to make sure we're being quite free with this. We're just adding 3 or 4 different layers of hills. We can change the shapes and the size of this later when we start to paint them in, but it's just so that we know where to bring our sky colour down to. If you are using a stretched canvas today like I am, you might choose to paint the sides, the top and the bottom as well, so I would always just say do that as you go. I'm just giving my paintbrush a good wash in the water before moving on to creating the first colour for our sky. So I would just like to say you can use any colours that you want, any patterns and shapes that you want. You don't have to follow along with me. I've just picked up a slightly bigger paintbrush and I'll be using this to fill in the top section of my sky. So I'm going to mix up a little bit more of a blue shade. So I've just added some more white as my base and I'm picking up a little bit of my blue and I'm mixing it in. So remember, you don't have to follow along with the exact shapes that I'm doing on the sky. The sky comes in all sorts of different patterns and shapes and hues, so you can really have fun with how you're applying your paint to the canvas, the colours that you're using. You can just follow along and use a few of the tips that I have for you, but you can then very much just go and make this painting your own. So I'm adding in some water to my paint just to make sure it stays nice and fluid. This is important when it comes to mixing in our different colours on the canvas. Now I'm just applying this paint to the top right hand side to start with. As you can see, I'm just using very flowing, free brush strokes. I'm trying not to overthink where I'm putting these marks too much. I'm painting the sides and the top as I go. And I'm leaving small gaps in the paint. Now this is so that we can then later on add in a different colour in between these blue marks. Now because I'm painting a sunset, I just want to make sure that there's lots of different tones in the sky, and I'm using very sweeping motions, just as though there might be a few clouds in the sky creating some movement. So we're going to be using our cooler colours, which I'm using now. These are the blues and the purples to kind of symbolise the day and also the night sky coming in, and then our warmer colours to symbolise where the sun is setting. So these will be our pinks, our peaches and our yellows. You can feather the paint out as well, and feathering just means pushing down very, very lightly where you get to the sort of edges of where you've applied your blue. You can then just flick the paintbrush out slightly, and this will give you a sort of feathered-like effect. It means that later, when we blend in our colours, we can then blend it over the feathered areas. Now you can sort of ignore the line for your mountain. We want the sun and the sunsets and the sky to look like it's going down behind the mountain, and we're going to be painting our hill over the top. So although we've drawn in our mountain line, kind of ignore where that is. You can overlap it slightly as you get down to there. I often find that when you're looking at wispy sunsets like this, the closer you get to the horizon, so for our case this will be the mountains, the lines get slightly thinner. So I'm being slightly thicker with the paint at the top of the canvas, and as I'm reaching the mountains, I've done slightly thinner lines, as you can see. I'm trying to work quite quickly, one because I want the paint to stay as wet as possible. This is just going to be helpful when we come to blending in our next colours, but also because I don't want to overthink what I'm doing. So I'm just mixing up another colour now, and I want to create a slightly darker shade. So I'm starting with white as my base, adding a little bit more blue, and I've just mixed this up right next to the colour that I previously used. This is just so I can see the change in the tone on my palette. What we can then do is start adding this darker tone on top of some of the areas that we've already painted. Now what this will do is it will just add an extra layer. You can then bring it down into some of the gaps. You might want to focus this right next to, right on top, and I'm just using a light touch as well. I'm not pushing down too hard. And because this is a sunset, I'm focusing the darker shades to the corners of my canvas. This just gives the painting a little bit more depth. I also recommend standing back, taking a moment, moving around, looking at something else and then looking back at your painting. Now remember, we don't want our sky to look neat, so try and be as free as possible with this. We don't want it to look symmetrical. I also always say try not to overly blend the paint. It's quite nice when you see a thick area of paint, and you can even have some of the paint, the texture of the paint, slightly thicker as well. Just picked up a little bit more of my darker blue, and I'm just adding that on top of my first shade, but I'm not covering up the whole thing. I want to still see some of those light blue hues coming through the gaps. If ever you feel like your paint is getting a bit dry or your paintbrush is getting a bit dry, do just add some water to it, dab it off in your kitchen towel, and then go back into your painting. Acrylic paint is a lovely versatile paint to use, but it can dry very, very quickly, especially if you're in a warm room or if it's a hot day. So adding the water just helps. So I'm just picking up some of my pure blue and I'm just sweeping it into some areas just to get slightly darker areas to give the painting and the sky a little bit of depth. As you can see, I'm being quite choppy with my paintbrush application. I'm trying not to be too neat. I'm changing the direction of the brushes and I'm working quite quickly, and I find that working quite quickly takes away some of the control. So I'm just giving my paintbrush a good wash in the water, dabbing it on the kitchen towel. Going to go ahead and mix up my next shade. So I'm just going to add a little bit of purple into this blue just to darken it up slightly. So if you've run out of your blue shade, you can always make a little bit more. I've added a little bit more white to it, a little bit more blue and purple. I always say just create whatever colour you want. You're not obliged to use it. If you create a colour on your palette and you don't like it, you don't have to use it. You can start again. You can either wash your paintbrush and start again, or just changing it up until you're happy. So I'm just adding some of these purple colours, again in the same way I did with the blues, just on top of and around, focusing some of this darker shade on the top right hand corner, just because that's where I feel like the night will be coming in from. The nice thing about the colours we're using today is that they all complement each other and blend in very nicely. If you are painting the sides and the top and the bottom of your canvas, this is just a little reminder to paint them as you go, so you don't have to go back and add them in afterwards. So I'm still leaving small gaps, as you can see, in between these colours, just so that I have some space for my warmer shades as well. And if you're using a stand-up easel like me, don't forget to remove the tabs just so that you can paint underneath them, so you're not leaving any of the canvas blank. Another tip I have for you, if you're finding it hard to sort of make free marks with your painting, hold your paintbrush at the end of the handle. This sort of forces you to have less control with your mark making, and you might find it slightly easier. At this point, you will be finding that your paint underneath is starting to dry if you're using acrylic paint, so do keep refreshing your paintbrush by adding some water to it. You can mix some water in with the paint and then go back into the painting. Just adding some of this purple to the top left hand corner of the canvas, just again to get that depth of the night sky coming in. You can add as many layers of paint as you like with this. It's almost harder to know when to stop. You can chop and change the patterns and the shapes and the colours that you're using for a painting like this for hours. So I've just added a little bit more white and a little bit more water to that purple, and I'm just focusing this around in some of the gaps underneath some of the blue. And again, as I get closer down to the mountains, I'm using slightly smaller brush strokes so they're not as thick. You can see I am adding quite a lot of water. Whenever I'm mixing up a new colour or picking up some more paint, I tend to add a bit of water to the brush before, just to make sure that it's easier to blend. I've just gone ahead and picked up a little bit of white on my brush. Without washing it off, I've just added some white, so I've got very lilac colour. I'm just starting to add that in between some of the gaps and overlapping some of the blue and some of the purple. Still trying to keep some blank canvas in between these cooler shades, just so that I can add some of my pinks and my yellows later on. At this point of the painting, if you feel like your sky is looking a bit messy, then please don't worry. We want it to look nice and free and natural. I find that these paintings take some patience and practice to let go of that control, to be freer with your mark making. You also might find a brush or a technique that you really like, a colour that you prefer, and I find that you can paint these scenes over and over again, and they'll look different each time. Just try to enjoy it, relax, enjoy the process. Don't be too hard on yourself. It all comes together once we start adding our forests and our mountains later on in the painting. So I'm just giving my brush a really good wash in the water, and I'm going to be drying it on my kitchen towel. What we're now going to do is just go in with a little bit of that water on the brush and just dash out and overlap and blend some of this paint. Now this water on the brush just helps us just get that nice kind of blended look. I'm almost just etching and scratching the paint on there. It's only a little bit of water, we don't want it to be dripping, so as you add it, just dab it on the kitchen towel. Just giving it another good wash in the water, dabbing it on the kitchen towel, and then moving back over to my palette. I'm going to mix up my next shade. Again, starting with white as the base, I'm just adding some pink and making a really light baby pink. I prefer to start with the lighter colours first, because then we can make them darker and add darker shades over the top. Again, I'm adding some water into this mixture, really mixing it in just to keep that paint nice and fluid. And make sure you haven't got too much paint on your brush. You can always add more if you need to. So I'm going to focus this pink to start with in some of these gaps. I just want to see some nice pops of baby pink coming through. So I'm trying not to touch the other paint just yet. We will be blending it in a moment. But just focus this in some of those gaps you've left. You don't have to fill them all in. Leave a few more gaps because we can go back in with some of our yellow. And you're likely to see more of these warmer shades towards where the mountains are, because I'm guessing the sun has just gone down behind the mountain, so this is where you're going to see the reflection of those warmer tones. So now you can start adding this pink on top of some of your purple and some of your blue. Now you might think that these colours won't blend well together, but actually once you blend pink and blue together, it does naturally make more of a lilac and a purple, so it does work quite well. If you want to be slightly bolder, you can just add a thicker layer of your pink. As you can see, I'm kind of using the brush at an angle, and this sort of helps get these nice wispy lines in the paint. And I'm only pushing down very lightly. If I push down lightly, I get a thinner line. If you push down firmer, you're going to get a thicker line. And we can always go back in with some more paint over the top just to make them really bold. Just don't be afraid to overlap your paint colours. This is where you get lovely blends and ombre effects. Next time you see a gorgeous hot sunset like this, you'll definitely notice all of the colours and all of the shapes and the patterns in the sky. That's the beauty of making art. You notice things in nature in a different way. So I'm just mixing up a slightly darker version right next to my lighter one. I've just added a tiny bit more of my pigmented of my pink in there. And I'm just adding some of these darker swoops over the top of some of my lighter shades of pink and around them, just to add another tone in the sky. Remember, if you don't like a colour that you've added to your canvas, just let it dry. We can always go back over it again. So if you've done a darker shade and you hate it, don't worry too much. We can just go over it with a lighter shade of pink. Just going to mix up a little bit more of this colour, just making it slightly darker, and then going in and adding a few of these darker shades of pink over the top again. Take a stand back, remember to look at something else, and then come back to your painting. If you want to, you can always go back to some of your lighter shades if you feel like you've lost them. If you need to mix up more, you can just mix up some more with some white and pink. And go back in. We're just doing a little dance now between all of our colours. A dance with our mixing and a dance on the canvas as well. Keeping our brushstrokes nice and free, swooping shapes that change direction. Just make sure nothing that you're doing is symmetrical. Try and make it different each time. Like I mentioned, this technique does take practice, so you might not love your first creation, but when you do it again, you'll have more of a sense of what works, what doesn't work for you. And like I mentioned at the start, just feel free to go a little bit more stylistic, abstract. You don't have to be neat with this. Just enjoy it. Just enjoy the process. As soon as you're happy with the pink shades that you've added, we're just going to give our brush a really good wash in the water. If you want to change your water at any time, you can also feel free to do so. I like to give it a little tap on the base of the cup just to lift off some of the excess paint. And again, just dab it on your kitchen towel. I'm now going to go ahead and mix up a light yellow. So starting with a scoop or 2 scoops of white as the base, I'm then just going to add a little bit of yellow, give it a mix. I just want a very light pastel shade to start with. We can always add a darker shade on the top. Once you've mixed it up, if you feel like you need to, you can just add a little bit of water to it again. Water is our friend at this stage, just because the more fluid the paint is, the easier it is to blend. So I'm just going to focus this yellow, just like we did with the pink, just in the gaps that we've left. And this is where if you want to just go over the top line of your mountain, feel free to do so, because we're going to be painting the mountain over the top. So I'm starting just by adding this yellow in all of the gaps, just so that I can get a nice pop of this colour, and then we'll go ahead and blend it like we did before. So I'm just filling in the gaps that I've left myself. And you will have a little bit more of this towards the base where the mountains are than you would at the top where the blue is. So just keep that in mind. You're going to have more of the warmer tones near the horizon line and more of the cooler tones towards the corners and the top of the canvas. What I'm now doing is I'm just swooping with this little bit of paint that I've got left on my brush. I'm just swooping it around in the sky, maybe over the top of some of the pink, and as you blend it out, you'll see it will turn a lovely sort of peach tone. So I'm kind of focusing this more wherever the pink is, just because naturally that's where it would be. But if you do want to go over some of the blue, you can. If the blue is still a bit wet, if you mix the yellow and the blue together, you'll get more of a green tone, which some people quite like for their skies. It gives it almost a northern lights effect, but other people like to keep them fairly separate. So again, totally up to you. I'm just going back in where I've got those bolder areas of the yellow, and I'm just sort of blending them out slightly using very light flicking motions. Keeping the shapes quite curved. Remembering to paint the tops and the sides as I go. I always forget one area, and at the end I have to mix up the colour again, so that's why I'm always telling everyone to paint the sides as you go. So because my blue area is now dried, I'm just swooping in a little bit of this yellow over the top. Then if you want to make them slightly more bold, you can just go ahead and add some thicker layers of paint. Like I said, it's quite nice seeing the texture of the paint on the canvas, especially when we're painting something like nature. At this point, just make sure you've sort of filled in all of the gaps on your canvas. At this point you can have a little stand back, and if you feel like you've lost any of the colours that you really loved because you've gone over them too much or they've overly blended, you can always go ahead and mix up some of that colour again and we can add it back onto the painting. So we're just building up the layers now. So I'm just going to give my brush a good wash in the water, and I feel like I've lost a little bit of my light pink, so I'm just going to go ahead and mix up a little bit more of my light pink, just making sure I haven't got any of that yellow left on my brush to start with. So just washing it off, and I'm just going to mix up a little bit more of my baby pink colour. That's just white as the base, a little bit of the pigmented pink on top. The nice thing about this is it is a dance between the colours, so I'm just going to pick some of this up, start adding it on top of some of the yellow and in between, just to reintroduce some of that shade back in there. If you're happy with how yours is looking, then you don't need to do this, but I think it's always nice to take a step back and reassess, add anything else that you need to. I'm now going to do the same thing with my light blue, just because I feel like I've lost a little bit of the light blue. Again, you don't need to do this if you don't feel like you need to, but I'm just going to give my brush a good wash in the water again and just mix up some of my lighter blue shade. Starting with white as the base and just adding a little bit of blue to it, just to make a nice light sky blue shade like we had at the start of the painting. Just dabbing off any of the excess so I haven't got too much on my brush, and I'm just going back to where I've got some of my light blue. I'm just adding a few more sweeps in. Just to really make that colour stand out. This is where you can add new swoops of this light blue colour as well if you feel like you want to. I really love the idea of a pastel rainbow sunset, so this is where I'm adding those colours back in where I feel like I've lost them. And just doing the same with a few of the darker colours as well, just adding a few new sweeps of them back in. Now I've just picked up a clean, bigger brush, and all I'm going to do is dip the bristles in the water, dab it off, and just use the sort of dampened bristles just to go over and blend out some of these colours. Most of them will be drying now, but the little bit of water on there just helps give it a blend anywhere that you think it needs it. If you don't want to do this stage, you don't have to, but just a little bit of water on a clean brush just to blend out some of these colours works quite nicely. Now for the last finishing touch for the sky, I'm just going to pick up a little bit of pure white paint on this brush. So I'm not going to add too much, just a tiny bit. And we're just going to add a little pop of highlight with the white. So I'm just dabbing off some of the excess. We don't want too much on our brush. And again, I'm just swooping this over some of the colours and blending it out. And this will just give that pop of highlight into the sky. I'm just keeping the bristles of the brush nice and damp so this is easy to blend out. I'm focusing this white towards the bottom of some of our colours and swoops, just because this is where we would get the highlight from the sun hitting the clouds in the sky. Again, if you don't want to do this bit, you don't have to. If you feel like you've added too much white like I've done here, just dab off any more, just add a little bit of water to your brush and then just blend it out. Don't panic or worry too much. So this is where it's hard to know when to stop painting in the sky. So if you're happy with how it's looking, we're now going to move on to creating the colour for the hills. So we're going to start with the top hill, so the one that's furthest away from us, the one that's closest to the sky. You can decide what tone of mountains you want to do. So I'm going to be going for more kind of purpley, earthy, grey tones for my mountains. If you want to go for more blue or more green, it's totally up to you. The rule that we've got is the mountain that's furthest away from us is going to be lighter, and then the mountain at the very base of the canvas, which is closest to us, is going to be more of a silhouette. So I've just started with a clean brush, and I'm just going to mix up the colour for my furthest away mountain to start with. So this is the lightest one. So I've added quite a lot of white as my base, and I'm just adding a little bit of purple to this, giving it a mix. Again, you can change up your colours however you want, just make sure that this is going to be the lightest mountain. It's the one that's furthest away, so we don't see the details as well. You can also experiment with your colours, so just start mixing them up and see what you prefer to add to your colours. Because I want my mountains to be slightly more grey, I'm just adding a tiny little bit of black into this paint just to make an almost very light grey shade. This just gives the paint a slightly more earthy tone. I'm also going to pick up some of my blue and I'm going to add that in there as well. I want my mountains to be more on the purple, blue, grey tone shades. I always suggest holding the paint up to the canvas as well, because then you can decide how light or dark you want it. I'm going to go a little bit darker, so I'm just adding a little bit more black into this, and again just really mixing it up. I'm just adding a little bit more of the blue and the purple in there just to get a little bit of colour back. I really have no clear plan with these colours. I'm just mixing them up until I'm happy with how they look. And as soon as you're happy, you can add some water to this, give it a good mix, and we're going to focus this on the mountain that's furthest away. So I'm just being careful, I'm just overlapping the sky ever so slightly. We want the sky to look like it's going down behind the mountain, and if you want to change the shape, this is where you can change the shape. I would just add a few little dips, a few lumps and bumps. We don't want this to be neat. And then we're going to be adding our very tiny little trees on the top of this line as well, so that we can see our forest really, really far, almost misty and hazy in the distance. So just enjoy filling in this area. I'm going to bring it down to meet the other mountains that I've drawn at the beginning. And you can be quite choppy with your paint application. We don't need to be neat with this. We want it to look a little bit rough. And most of that mountain is going to be then covered up by the next layer of the trees and so on and so forth. So this will be the lightest colour of my mountain. So I'm going to progressively make the paint slightly darker as we go down towards the base of the canvas, and then the mountain at the very, very bottom, the one that's essentially closest to us, is going to be very dark, almost like a silhouette, so either black or a very, very dark grey. Again, if you've chosen to do greens for yours or any other shades, if you've gone more abstract and done red mountains, as long as you're following the same formula, so the one at the back is slightly lighter and the one at the very base is darker, then you'll be all good. We're now going to move on to creating the layer of trees that sit on the very top of this mountain. So you might want to have an experiment with this. You might have a spare bit of paper that you want to try this out with. You might want to try a few different brushes. I've just picked up this more of a medium shaped brush which has got a flat edge. So if that's my hill there, I'm just going to be doing little dabs. You can just see I'm almost dabbing the paintbrush onto the top of that hill. And this will just create the look that there are tiny little trees really, really far in the distance. So you can just start dabbing them on now. Again, practice this if you want to first. I just quite like to be free with this. I don't want them to be too neat, too precise. They look very strange when we first start. They don't really look like trees at all. But as we add our other trees and our other layers that are a little bit more detailed as we get down to the base of the canvas, this all then makes sense because they just look like tiny trees in the distance. And as my mountain slopes down, I'm just kind of following the trees so they are all relative. I haven't got lots of tall trees. I'm just dipping them in, making sure each one is a slightly different size, so that they're not all too uniform. You might have a few which are taller, some which are smaller. When that's all filled in, we're going to mix up our next colour. So I've got my white as my base and I'm just mixing this up underneath my first shade just so I can see that it's definitely darker. The paint always dries slightly darker than it is when it's wet, so I always bear that in mind. But I've just started with my white, added a bit of my blue, a bit of the purple, and I'm adding a little bit more black to this, and I'm just going to carry on adding the blue, the purple and the black until I have a shade or 2 shades darker than my first mountain. So take your time with this, there's no rush. I like to mix this up right underneath my first shade or right next to it just so I can see, and then I test it on the canvas. So if you think that this is too close, you can always make it slightly darker. But just remember that the paint does dry a little bit darker. And you only want a very subtle change. So again, I'm just going to fill in this next mountain, bringing it up just to overlap the top one, just because the top mountain needs to look like it's going down behind this one, so you can overlap the top one slightly. Don't forget to do the sides. And then just bring it down to meet the line for your next hills or mountains. We're now going to go ahead and add the next layer of trees. So these are going to be slightly more detailed than the first set that we've just drawn, just because they're getting closer and closer to us. So we're going to see a little bit more detail on these, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. You can practice again on a spare bit of paper. You'll soon get the knack for it because it's the same thing each time. You might want to experiment with a couple of different paintbrushes, just see which one works better for you. So I'm just taking a very small thin paintbrush, and I'm going to start by drawing a line, and this will be the trunk of the tree. So just a straight line going down to meet the top of the mountain. And then to add the bristles, I just do little sort of flicks and dabs on each side of this line, getting slightly longer as we go down the line all the way to the bottom. And I've left small little gaps in between these branches, but you don't have to. There are 2 different ways of doing this, and I'll show you both. So if that's our mountain, that's our tree, and it comes all the way down to meet it. And then we'll be doing another one next to it. You might change up the size, so this one might be smaller. And just remember that where the branches come down, they will probably meet the other tree, and that's okay. You want it to look like a lovely, full, healthy forest. You can even do another tree in between them, just so they're overlapping. So it'll be slightly thicker at the base. The other way of doing it is the same thing, a line going down, but you might just not want the gaps in between. I always find that there are a few gaps at the top where the branches are slightly sparser, but then towards the middle and the base of the tree, they are quite almost thick and fluffy. So I always start with the line first, and then always flick the branches outwards. So start with the middle, flick the bristles outwards, and this just helps you get a little bit of lift at the end of the brush and really helps you get these tree-like branch effects. And again, these are quite far away, so they're not going to be too neat or too perfect. Each tree needs to be nice and individual and unique. And it does feel a little bit like sabotage because we're now painting over some of our sky, but it is quite nice when you see those pops of colours through the branches. And we're just going to do this all the way along that mountain line. And where we get to our other mountain, just ignore it and we're going to go over the top of it. We need to look like these trees are in front of the trees and the mountain that we've already painted. And just enjoy this process. Once you get into it, it's the same formula each time, we're just repeating it. You can always go back afterwards and make them slightly neater, add in a few extras in between them if you feel like they need extras. And just vary the height of the trees as well, just so that they don't look too uniform. As a little tip, just make sure you haven't got too much paint on your brush. You might be finding it a little bit easier if you haven't got too much paint on there. And I am resting my hand on the drier areas of the canvas, just so I have a little bit more control with this. Once you've filled in that line, you can always go back and touch up any of the trees if you feel like you need to. I'm now going to go ahead and mix up my next colour. So in exactly the same way, I'm still starting with white as my base, just because white paint helps make the paint a little bit more opaque, so less see-through. We want this to be nice and thick and non-see-through. So I've started with white, I've added the blue, a little bit of purple, and then I'll add the black as well, and we just want this colour to be darker than the one before. So exactly the same thing, just carry on mixing up that paint until you're happy that it's a darker shade. I would add a bit of water into this as well, just to keep it nice and fluid, and then you can go ahead and test it on the canvas. And if you're happy, you can go ahead and do exactly the same thing. We're just going to fill in this mountain, bringing it up to that top line, overlapping that top mountain ever so slightly, just so it looks like this mountain is in the front, and then bringing it down to the line that we've got for our bottom mountain as well. So the trees that we're going to be adding onto this are going to be slightly bigger than the last set of trees, so we're going to be seeing a little bit more detail. However, it's exactly the same process. We'll be starting with the line for our trunk and then be adding our bristles and our branches, flicking out from the side of that main line, and I'll be showing you how to do this again. Feel free to practice it if you want to. So I'm starting on the right hand side, and I've just drawn a line going up with my smaller brush, and then I'm just adding the little sparse bristles at the top, and then just using this brush, just flicking out the branches either side all the way down to the base, and I'm not leaving a gap. I'm bringing these branches all the way down so they're flush with the base. The other thing you can do is use a slightly bigger brush, so maybe a medium-sized brush. So I've got a medium-sized square brush here, and I'll be using this to fill in some of the lower bristles, which are, or branches even, which are slightly thicker. So it's up to you. Some people prefer to use bigger brush. I prefer to do a little dance between the brushes, so using the bigger brush to do the thicker bristles and branches at the base of the tree, and then I use the smaller brush maybe just to elongate the very top of the tree and do the slightly more delicate branches at the sides. I always then go in afterwards and try and be really careful and add a bit of height to the trees that are just very thin and delicate, and then add a few tiny little separated branches at the very top of these trees. So we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to go all the way along this mountain, ignoring what we've done before, and just adding these trees on the top. Again, just keep the sizes and the shapes sort of varied. You want to make sure they don't look too uniform. And then afterwards, if you feel like you need to, you can always go ahead and fill in any gaps if you feel like there are too many gaps between them. I think the trick is just making sure you're bringing the branches all the way down to the base. It almost feels a bit pointless because sometimes you don't see them because they're overlapping, but actually when you take a step back, it just makes it look like a really full, healthy forest. And as you have sort of peaks in your mountain where they go up slightly, your trees are going to be a little bit higher. So you can bear that in mind as well. I would always say take a little step back, make sure your trees aren't too slanted to one side. You might then need to change it up slightly. But take your time with this, enjoy it. Again, it's the same process each time. The more you practice this, the more that you do it, the easier it all becomes. Again, as you get to where you're overlapping your previous trees, just carry on with the process, overlap them, cover them up, it doesn't matter. You'll still be able to see some of them peeking through the branches, and it all makes sense with the perspective. I'm not going to go ahead and add any more trees here because my first layer is going to cover this all up, but I am going to go ahead and now mix up my last colour for my last mountain. So again, I'm just going to start with a large amount of blue, black and a bit of purple, and this is going to be much darker, so I'm not really adding much white into this. I've got the paint that was still left on my brush. Maybe add a tiny bit of white to keep it opaque, but we really want this to be the darker shade, so just blue, black, purple. I'm almost making mine a slightly more navy tone. It looks very black when it's going on the canvas, but it's slightly more navy. And now we're going to be filling in the last mountain with this colour, again wrapping it around the sides, bringing it all the way down to the base. If you are on an easel like me, you might just want to lift off the canvas as well, just to make sure that you're covering up every area of the canvas. So you should be an absolute pro at these trees now. This is exactly the same thing. We're just doing a line as our trunk, and this is going to overlap and be the tallest of all of the trees. We want to be able to see the trees that we've got behind it, so just vary the sizes. What I'm doing with these trees is I'm using my bigger brush almost sort of halfway down, or just over halfway down the trunk, and I'm flicking them out either side, almost lifting up the bristles so that you can really see the branches, bringing them all the way down to meet the mountain. And then I'll go ahead and use my smaller brush to add the smaller branches at the very top of the tree, which are slightly more sparse. Just using a very light touch, adding a few of those branches, and then you can always go ahead and add little flicks on the outer areas of the bigger branches towards the base of the tree, and if you want to elongate the top you can as well. Also doing a tree almost as if it's right on the edge of the canvas. I'm going to paint it on the other side as well, so no matter what angle I look at the painting, it's all covered up. It almost wraps around the sides, the top and the bottom. We're just going to go ahead and carry on adding these trees all along the last hill of our painting. Again, just vary the sizes. As I've got a little valley in my painting, I'm just going to bring the trees down so they're slightly shorter so I can sort of see into the painting, see into the background. But you know what you're doing now. Just make sure that these trees are really overlapping. It does feel really weird when you've just got a block of dark colour, but actually it all makes sense. We want these trees, they're all close together, so we want them to overlap each other. If there's too many gaps, it looks like the forest isn't as healthy. I like to take a little bit of a step back when I'm doing this, just to make sure that the line is nice and straight, and then I go ahead and add the branches, and I definitely try and look away as much as possible, because when you've been staring at a painting for so long, you can kind of get quite fed up with it and you can't see the perspective properly. You almost don't appreciate it so much, but actually having a little bit of perspective and standing back, looking at something else for a moment and then coming back to your painting can actually be very, very helpful. And remember, if this is your first time painting something like this or painting trees like this, be kind to yourself. This is a technique and a practice that takes some time. And remember, you can always go abstract. That's what I always say. If you're not happy and you feel like your trees in your painting isn't that neat, it doesn't matter. Nothing in art needs to be precise or neat, and nothing in nature is ever symmetrical. So give yourself a bit of freedom to just have fun with this. I'm making the last tree of my painting on the left hand side quite a tall tree. This one is probably a lot closer to us. So it's going to overlap the little tree next to it. You'll still be able to see that tree, but it'll just mean that this bigger tree looks like it's slightly closer, just to give us that depth. As a last finishing touch, I'm just going to go back in and fill in any gaps that I feel I need filling. And on the base where I've got this mountain, I'm just going to add another layer of paint, but I'm just going to apply it in a really choppy way. So I'm just going to use crisscrossing motions with my paintbrush. I want it to look quite rough, like there's lots of foliage down there. I don't want it to look too neat. So I'm just going back over that whole section just with the same colour, just adding blobs of paint and just being quite scratchy with my application. This is also an opportunity to take a step back, look at your painting, change anything, add anything, amend anything in your trees. You also might like to paint the bottom of your canvas as well, especially if this is going up on the wall. You don't want to see any of the blank canvas left at the base. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that you found it calming. If you didn't, hopefully you'll give it a go again and you'll enjoy it the next time. Art takes patience and practice, but it can be incredibly rewarding at the very end. So I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you like this video, then do let us know in the comments below and give us a little thumbs up. It really helps us out. We bring you new art tutorials all the time so that you can get creative from home. Thank you, everyone. Bye.